The Hall of Nine Thrones had been built to make visitors feel small, and it was very good at its job. It rose out of the crust of Valeth Prime like a wound that had decided to become architecture. 2 kilometers of black basalt and fused starlight, a bowl of tiered galleries deep enough to hold weather. When the council convened in full session, mist gathered near the ceiling and drifted down over the delegates in slow gray banners, and the acoustics were tuned so that a whisper from the first throne would arrive at the lowest bench as a murmur in the listener's own bones. 9 thrones ringed the floor. Above them, suspended in a null field, hung the weft map, a living hologram of the galaxy's transit network, 3,106 anchor gates rendered as points of pale gold, strung together with threads of light that pulsed like something with a heartbeat. Every trade route in known space ran through those threads. Every fleet, every grain shipment, every migration, every messenger, every war. The map was the reason the hall existed. The map was the reason anyone came. And beneath the map, in the 11th gallery, in a folding seat that had been assigned to her, because nobody had thought hard enough about where to put her, sat a 21-year-old human named Iolanthe Ferreira, drinking coffee out of a dented steel thermos and taking notes with a stylus she had chewed the end of. She was, at that moment, the only human being on the planet. The council had decided that this was appropriate. In fact, the council had spent 4 days arguing about it, and had settled on the arrangement with a certain amount of satisfaction. The Terran custodial delegation had been invited to send a representative to the session, invited in the sense that a summons is an invitation, and the Terrans had responded by sending a junior attaché, 3rd class, aged 21, with no security detail, no legal counsel, and no diplomatic rank worth the ink. The council had chosen to read this as surrender, as an admission that humanity understood the size of the hand about to close on it, and had elected not to waste anyone important on the closing. Praetor Regnant Asuval Thray of the Valeth, who sat the first throne, had said as much to his advisors that morning, over a breakfast of poached spine fruit, and a report he had waited 9 years to read. They sent a girl, he had said, and his mandibles had performed the slow lateral scissor that in his people passed for laughter. They sent a girl with a notebook. Let the record show it. When the histories are written, let them show that the species which reached above itself was extinguished while its representative took minutes. The advisors had laughed with him, because that was the arrangement. Now, 4 hours into the session, with the mist coming down in ribbons and the map turning slow overhead, Praetor Thray rose from the first throne to read Instrument 7 into the record. He was a magnificent creature, and he knew it. Valeth physiology favored height and length. Thray stood nearly 3 meters when he unfolded, a column of segmented chitin the color of old bronze, his 4 arms folded in the formal lattice, his crest of sensory filaments combed and oiled and rippling in the chamber's draft. He wore the mantle of the first throne, which was not cloth but a slow-moving skin of living metal, and it made him look like something that had been poured rather than born. He let the silence stretch. He was good at silence. He had built a career in the gaps between other people's sentences. Delegates of the conquered, he said, thrones and speakers, clients and charters. We have come to the end of the deliberation. Below him, in the well of the floor, the instrument itself sat on a plinth, a slab of engraved crystal the size of a coffin lid, because the conquered did not believe in doing paperwork small. For 41 years, Thray said, this council has extended to the human species a concession. I use the word deliberately, concession, a thing given out of the abundance of the giver to one who has not earned it. In the 11th gallery, Io Ferreira set down her thermos and started writing. We found them, Thray continued, clinging to a single star, having burned most of it. We found them fractious, short-lived, chemically unstable, prone to violence, prone to sentiment, prone, and I say this with the pity it deserves, to hope. And we did not destroy them. We could have. Instrument 2 would have permitted it in that year under the doctrine of emergent threat. We did not. Instead, this council, in its mercy, gave them work. A murmur of assent moved through the galleries, the sound of 9,000 delegates agreeing with a thing that flattered them. We gave them the custodial concession, Threy said. Perpetual, exclusive, non-transferable, the physical maintenance of the weft, the crawlways, the coolant lattices, the anchor bearings, the 10,000 small filthy tasks that no civilized species has performed since the ones who built the gates walked out of the galaxy and closed the door behind them. We gave humanity the mop, delegates. And we gave it gladly, and we paid it in scrap and transit rights, and we did not think about it again for 4 decades, because one does not think about the mop. He turned slowly, the mantle sliding over his carapace, and he lifted one arm toward the map. That, he said, was an error. The hall went very quiet. 9 years ago, Threy said, the office of the First Throne began to notice irregularities. Anchor 41 in the Ordovai Reach was reported by our surveyors as operating at 103% of its rated throughput. This was dismissed as instrument error. It was not instrument error. Anchor 16, 2 years later, 109%. Anchor 212, 122%, and a 4th transit lane where the builders had left 3. He let that sit. The weft is not improvable, Threy said. This is the first axiom of conquered engineering. The ones who left us these gates left us no manuals, no schematics, no keys. Their machines are beyond us. We do not repair them. We replace failed components with the spares they stockpiled, and when the spares run out, the gate dies, and we mourn and we root around it. In 11,000 years of conquered history, no species has ever added a transit lane to an anchor gate. It cannot be done. His crest lifted. It is being done. It has been done 490 times. And every single one of those gates was, at the time, under the exclusive custodial care of the human species. The murmur that went through the galleries this time had a different shape, sharper, hungrier. I.O. Ferreira kept writing. Her handwriting, if anyone had leaned over to look, was terrible. They have not merely maintained the weft, Threy said. They have learned it. They have gotten inside it physically, literally inside into the crawl spaces where the radiation would cook any decent organism, where the geometry does unpleasant things to the mind, where a Valith would go mad in 6 hours and an Ithkar would simply stop. Humans go in for weeks. They take sandwiches. They take music. They come out singing and they come out knowing things. He turned and faced the galleries. And 11 months ago, our listening posts recorded something that has forced this council's hand. From the core of Anchor 1, the first gate, the oldest, the one we have never been able to open, a signal. Not a mechanical signal. A voice. In a language none of our linguists could parse, but in a rhythm, delegates, a rhythm any of us could recognize. Threy's 4 hands came apart and folded again, in the gesture the Valith used for grief and for theft. Conversation, he said. Something inside Anchor 1 is talking, and it is not talking to us. The hall erupted. It took the speaker of Order 2 full minutes and 1 discharge of the sonic gavel to bring it back down, and by then the second throne was already standing. Matriarch Selavan of the Ithkar was a lattice of pale blue crystal grown into the rough shape of a seated figure, and when she spoke, the sound came from the resonance of her own body, a chiming that the translators rendered as a woman's low and reasonable voice. The first throne states the danger, she said. Let the first throne state the remedy. Gladly, said Threy. He walked down the shallow steps to the plinth and laid one hand on the crystal slab of Instrument 7, and he did not look up at the 11th gallery. He had already forgotten she was there. That was the thing I.O. would remember, afterward, more clearly than the words, not malice, but the completeness of his forgetting. Instrument 7, Threy read, the sanction of erasure. Enacted this day by the Council of 9 Thrones, sitting in full and lawful session, in the matter of the species Homo sapiens, native to the world designated Sol 3. He read it in the flat cadence of a man reading a shipping manifest. Article 1. The custodial concession is hereby revoked in its entirety, effective immediately, without compensation, and all assets, tools, vessels, records, and personnel presently engaged under its authority are declared forfeit to the Council. The galleries were silent now, properly silent. Article 2. All human presence within conquered space is declared unlawful. All human vessels are declared derelict and subject to seizure. All human settlements outside the Sol system are declared vacant and open to claim by the seated thrones, according to the schedule of division appended hereto. Somewhere in the 9th gallery, a small Ordovi delegate made a sound like a kettle and was hushed by her aides. Article 3, said Threy. The Reclamation Fleet, 4,011 hulls under the command of Grand Marshal Vosk, presently staged at anchor approaches in 11 sectors, is ordered to proceed to Sol 3 and to render the planet incapable of sustaining the human species. The Council recognizes that this action will be described, by the sentimental, as genocide. The Council notes that a species which has, without permission, without oversight, and without loyalty established private contact with a surviving intelligence of the gate builders is not a species. It is a fuse, and a fuse is not murdered. A fuse is cut. He looked up then, and his crest flared, and his voice filled the bowl of the hall the way water fills a cup. Article 4. Upon the completion of Article 3, all weft infrastructure formerly under human custodial care shall pass to the direct administration of the First Throne in trust for the benefit of the conquered entire, and the intelligence within Anchor 1 shall be secured, opened, and made to speak to its rightful heirs. There it was, I.O. underlined it twice. The whole 4-hour session, the whole 9-year investigation, the whole coffin lid of engraved crystal, and it came down to that one word, sitting in the middle of the sentence like a hand in someone else's pocket. Secured. The vote, said the Speaker of Order. It took 90 seconds. The thrones voted first in order of precedence, and then the seated charters and then the clients, whose votes were tallied in blocks and weighted at a fifth. The result appeared on the map, written across the golden threads in letters 4 meters high. For 8,807, against 4, abstain 190. Praetor Regnant Osuval Threy of the Valeth placed his hand on the instrument, and the crystal drank his authority and glowed, and he said the words that the conquered's law required, the same 3 words that had ended 11 species before this one, the words that made an order out of a wish. Destroy them, he said, let it be done. And in the 11th gallery, a 21-year-old girl with a chewed stylus and a dented thermos capped her pen, and stood up, and said, in a voice pitched exactly for the acoustics of a room built to make her feel small. Too late. The Hall of 9 Thrones had been designed by an architect who wanted a whisper from the floor to reach the highest bench. Nobody had considered the reverse, because nobody had imagined that anything worth hearing would ever be said from the 11th gallery. But sound is sound, and stone is stone, and the bowl worked in both directions, and so the girl's 2 soft syllables went sliding down the black basalt, gathering weight as they fell, and arrived at the foot of the first throne with the flat finality of a dropped coin. 9,000 heads turned. Praetor Threy, whose hand was still resting on the instrument, whose crest was still flared with the pleasure of a plan concluded, turned last of all. His sensory filaments swept the galleries and found her, a smudge of a thing, wearing the gray coverall of a Terran custodial rating with a diplomatic tab clipped crookedly to the collar, brown-skinned, black hair cropped short and badly, a burned scar across the back of her right hand that anyone who had ever worked a coolant lattice would have recognized instantly, and nobody in that chamber did. She looked to him like something that had wandered in from a maintenance corridor, which, in the strictest sense, she had. "The gallery will be silent," said the speaker of order. "That's fine," said Io Ferreira. "I've finished." She sat down. And that she would think about this later on the long, quiet flight home, and it would still make no sense to her. That was the thing that broke him. Not the words. The sitting down. He had ordered the extinction of her species, and she had stood up, said 2 words, and sat back down and picked up her coffee. "Bring her," said Praetor Threy. They brought her down through the galleries, 2 Veilith proctors flanking her, their claw hands hovering at her elbows without touching, because the protocols forbade contact with an accredited delegate, and even in the middle of a genocide the conquered was very serious about its protocols. She walked without hurrying. She carried the thermos. She stopped at the edge of the well and looked at the plinth, and at the coffin lid of crystal, and at the 3-meter creature standing over it, and she did not appear to be frightened, and that was the second thing that broke him. "Say it again," said Threy. "Which part?" "You spoke in this chamber. You interrupted an instrument of the council. Under Article 19 you may be compelled to explain yourself, and you will be, and then you will be held, and then you will be given to my scientists, because you are the last human being any of us will ever get to ask questions of. So say it again, and this time say it to my face so that the record is complete." Io Ferreira looked up at him. She was 5'4". She had been on Veilith Prime for 11 days. She had eaten nothing but ration paste and hotel fruit that entire time, and she had slept badly, and her ears hurt from the pressure differential, and her mother had been dead for 7 years, and she was not, by any measure the conquered recognized, important. "You said destroy them," she said, "and I said too late." "Too late," Threy repeated. "You claim we cannot." "No," she shook her head. "I'm sure you could have 4,000 ships. Sol's not defended, not really, we never built for that. We spent everything on tenders and haulers and coolant. You'd have gotten through in about 6 hours. She said it evenly, like a survey estimate. "That's not what I meant." "Then be precise, girl." "All right." Io set the thermos down on the edge of the plinth, on the engraved crystal, on the sanction of erasure, which struck several delegates as the single most offensive thing they had ever witnessed, and which she did without any apparent awareness that it was happening. "You said destroy them," she said, "but you're talking about a thing you do, future tense. A thing you're going to start doing once your Grand Marshal gets your order, and he'll get it in." She glanced at her slate, about 4 minutes, allowing for relay. "And then he'll move." "He will." "He won't," said Io Ferreira. "That's the first part, but it's not the important part. The important part is that all of this," she gestured loosely at the hall, at the thrones, at the map turning gold above them, at 11,000 years of the conquered, all of this already happened. You just did it 11 minutes ago, and you did it out loud, and you did it in front of everyone. "In front of 9,000 loyal delegates," said Threy. "No," said Io, "in front of everyone." And above them, silently, without any ceremony at all, the first golden light on the weft map went out. Nobody noticed it at first. 3,106 points of light is a great many, and one going dark is nothing, a maintenance cycle, a rendering artifact, a flicker. Anchor 2009 in the Corvin Drift simply stopped being gold. It did not explode. It did not go red. The Conquered's alert systems, which were tuned to detect attack, detected nothing, because nothing was attacking it. The gate had gone into what the human tenders called a curtsy, a slow, graceful, entirely voluntary shutdown, all lanes furled, all fields banked, the great ring going quiet and cold and still, the way a machine goes when it has been told politely that it may rest. It would be 11 minutes before anyone in the Hall of 9 Thrones looked up. To understand what happened in that chamber, it is necessary to understand what the Conquered had built its empire on, and what it had never once bothered to look at. Nobody knew who had made the weft. The Conquered scholars called them the Departed, which was less a name than a shrug, and the archaeological consensus held that they had finished whatever they were doing about 90,000 years before the first Valeth cracked the first flint. What they left behind was a network, 3,106 ring gates, each 180 kilometers in diameter, each one hanging motionless in the gravitational quiet of some star system's outer dark, each one capable of folding a ship from one anchor to any other in the network in the time it took to say so. The weft was the galaxy. Without it, the galaxy was just a very large number of very lonely stars. Every species that had ever risen to the weft had done the same three things in the same order. First, they had worshipped it. Second, they had tried to understand it and failed and been humiliated by the failing. And third, they had built a legal system on top of it, because if you cannot own a thing's workings, you can at least own the right to stand near it. That legal system was the conquered. 11,000 years of case law, licensure, transit tariffs, and precedents, all of it resting on the unexamined assumption that the gates would keep working forever, because they always had. They did not always, they failed. Slowly, invisibly, at a rate of roughly 1 anchor per century, the weft was dying, bearings scoring, coolant lattices silting, the vast hidden lungs of the thing clogging with 90,000 years of dust. And the Conquered's response to this had been to establish an office, appoint a committee, and rotate the maintenance contract among whichever client species was currently least able to refuse it. It was miserable work. The interior of an anchor gate was a place where the geometry did not sit still. Corridors that were 4 meters long going in and 11 coming out. Gravity that ran sideways along the wall you were standing on. Radiation that was not quite radiation and did something to memory that no medical service had ever managed to name. The Ithkar had held the contract for 2 centuries and had abandoned it after their crews began to fracture, literally, crystalline bodies developing hairline splits, like ice under stress. The Corvin had lasted 40 years. The Kelsha had lasted 6. And then, 41 years ago, a delegation of humans had arrived at the Conquered's outer marches in 9 ships held together with weld scar and stubbornness, and had asked to be let in. The council had laughed at them. The council had then, in a gesture that the minutes record as an act of surpassing generosity, offered them the custodial concession. The humans had read it, all of it, which was itself remarkable, because it ran to 900,000 words and nobody had read it in a century. They had read it and they had asked for one change, Article 9, the exclusivity clause, to be strengthened. Perpetual, exclusive, non-transferable responsibility for the physical maintenance of weft infrastructure. Not a right, a responsibility. They wanted it locked so tight that no future council could take it back without dissolving the Conquered itself. The council had found this hilarious and had granted it, and had gone to lunch. "You gave us the whole thing," said Io Ferrara, standing in the well of the hall with her hand resting on the edge of the plinth. "Every gate, every crawlway, every square meter of the inside of the machine that your entire civilization is standing on. And then you went away for 41 years and didn't visit." "We paid you," said Praetor Threy. "You didn't, actually." She said it without heat. "You paid us in salvage rights and transit permits. You gave us the right to keep whatever we pulled out of the gates as scrap. Do you know what we pulled out of the gates, Praetor?" "Dust." "Yeah," said Io. "Mostly dust. 90,000 years of it. And bearings and latticecore and about 600,000 tons of a material your metallurgists have never been able to synthesize and which we've been quietly using to build hulls with." She shrugged. "But that's not the good part either." "Then what?" said Threy, and there was the first thin crack in the enormous calm of him, "is the good part?" "The good part," said Io, "is that we listened." Her mother's name was Marisol Ferrara, and she had been a grade 2 tender on the Anchor 9 crew for 19 years, and Io had grown up in the crawlways the way other children grow up in orchards. You started young because you were small. That was the whole logic of it. The interior passages of a gate had been built by things with a different idea of comfort, and there were sections of the coolant lattice at Anchor 9 that a full-grown adult could not enter without cutting, and cutting was forbidden. So the tender crews raised their kids in the yards, and the kids went in at 9 and 10 years old with a helmet lamp and a bag of sensor tacks, and they came back out with the readings, and everybody pretended it was normal, because for them it was. Io Ferreira had spent 906 hours inside the body of Anchor 9 before her 14th birthday. She knew what a gate sounded like. That was a thing that nobody in the Hall of Nine Thrones knew, not one of them, not the Praetor with his 9-year investigation, not the matriarch with her fleets of instruments. The gates made noise, not much. A slow rolling hum in the lattice, a sound like a very large animal breathing in its sleep, and under that, if you switched off your lamp and stopped moving and let your ears open all the way up, a pattern. Not a random pattern. It changed depending on where you were. It changed depending on what you did. If you patched a coolant seam, the hum in that section went smooth and stayed smooth. If you did a bad job, it stuttered, a little irregular hitch, right at the spot you'd botched, over and over until you came back and did it properly. And then it would go smooth again and stay smooth for a while. And then sometimes, if you sat very still, it would do something else. It would repeat your own pulse back to you. The tenders had known this for 30 years. Every single crew, on every single gate, in every single sector, and not one of them had ever put it in a report, because the report would have gone to the conquered Office of Custodial Affairs, and the Office of Custodial Affairs had made its opinion of human observations extremely clear on 9 separate occasions, the last of which had involved a formal reprimand for the submission of unsolicited technical speculation by unqualified personnel. So the humans stopped submitting, and they kept listening. "You are describing," said Matriarch Sullivan from the second throne, and her chiming voice had gone very careful, "an intelligence." "I'm describing a caretaker," said Io. "There's a difference. It doesn't want anything. It doesn't have plans. It's not a—" She searched for the word and gave up on the conquered's vocabulary and used her own. "It's not a person exactly. It's more like a very old dog that's been left alone in a house for 90,000 years, still doing its job, still walking the halls at night, still checking the doors. And nobody came home." "And humans came home," said Sullivan. "Humans came in with a wrench," said Io, "and fixed the doors." She turned back to Threy. "You want to know why it talks to us and not to you? It's not a secret, Praetor. It's not a conspiracy. It's the most boring reason in the universe. We're the ones who showed up." She lifted her scarred right hand, palm out, and it was a small hand, and the scar across the back of it was the pale silver of an old coolant burn. For 41 years, every day, every shift, somebody human inside that machine with a rag and a torque wrench fixing something. That's it. That's the whole trick. You've been trying to break into a house for 11,000 years, and we've been living in the basement and taking out the trash, and one day the thing that lives upstairs came down and said hello. "And what," said Threy very quietly, "did it say?" Io Ferreira was silent for a moment. "It said my mother's name," she said. Marisol Ferreira had died at 51 in the 9th hour of a breach seal on the Anchor 9 primary lattice, when a coolant line that had held for 90,000 years chose that particular afternoon to stop holding. She had been inside the gap. She had gotten the seal on. The seal had held. The gate had come back up 11 hours later at 101% of rated throughput, which was, at the time, a record. Io had been 14. She had been in the yard in the shed eating a sandwich. The tenders had a saying about it afterward, which they said at funerals and did not explain to outsiders. She left it better than she found it. 4 years later, Io Ferreira, 18 years old, grade 1, 300 hours logged, sleeping in the same bunk her mother had slept in, went into the deep lattice at Anchor 9 on a routine sweep, and switched off her lamp and sat down in the dark to eat lunch, and listened to the hum. And the hum said, Marisol. Not in words, it had no words. It said it in the pattern of the pulse, in the rhythm of the breathing of the great sleeping thing, 4 beats and a rest, the exact cadence of a name that a 14-year-old girl had shouted into a calm channel that had already gone dead. Io had sat in the dark for 6 hours. Then she had come out, and she had not told the Office of Custodial Affairs, and she had not told the Council, and she had not told anyone at all except the 11 other people on her crew, and eventually, over the following 3 years, in a way that nobody had planned and nobody had organized, 400,000 human beings. Because that was the other thing the conquered had never thought about. There were 400,000 humans working the weft, spread across 3,106 gates in 11 sectors, on crews of 40 and 50 and 90. They rotated. They swapped berths. They married across crews. They buried each other. They traded tools and grudges and gossip on a network of low-band tender channels that the conquered had never bothered to monitor, because it carried nothing but shift schedules and complaints about food. Humanity was not, in the conquered's mind, a polity. Humanity was a workforce. And a workforce, when it decides on something, does not need to hold a vote. 4 minutes, said Io, glancing at her slate. That's what I said, right? 4 minutes for your order to reach Grand Marshal Vosk. She looked up. It's been 11. The Praetor did not move. But behind him, at the base of the first throne, an aide had gone very still in a way that Valith aides were trained never to do in session, and was pressing 4 fingers to the side of his own head, and was listening to something. Speak, said Thray without turning. The aide's crest was flat against his skull. The reclamation fleet acknowledges the order, Praetor, he said. Then it moves. The aide stopped, started again. Praetor, the fleet acknowledges the order and reports that it is unable to comply. The Hall of 9 Thrones, 9,000 delegates deep, did not make a sound. Grand Marshal Vosk reports, the aide said, that the anchor approach at Corvin Drift is not responding to transit request. That anchor 2009 has furled. That his staged squadrons, 1,100 hulls, Praetor, are holding at station with no lane to enter and no lane to leave, and that the same report is arriving from Sector 4 and Sector 6, and... He stopped again, and this time it was not hesitation. It was that he had run out of a category of thought. Praetor, he said, the gates are curtsying. And 9,000 delegates, as one looked up. The weft map hung above them in the mist, 3,106 points of gold, the arteries of 11,000 years of civilization, and as they watched, slowly, quietly, without violence, without a single shot fired anywhere in the galaxy, the lights began to go out. Not all of them. That was the part that took the longest to understand, and the part that would, in the end, be the most terrible. Not all of them. Just the ones the fleets were standing on. Io Ferreira picked up her thermos from the top of the sanction of erasure, and unscrewed the cap, and poured herself the last of the coffee, and did not look up at the map at all, because she already knew what it said. 4,011 hulls, she said, staged at anchor approaches in 11 sectors. That's what you read into the record, Praetor. That's what you told this whole chamber out loud 10 minutes before you gave the order. She blew on the coffee. You put your entire navy inside our house. You have not, said Thray, and his voice had changed. It had gone thin and hard, and the beautiful rolling authority had drained out of it and left something else behind, something that had been sitting underneath it the whole time. You have not destroyed a single ship. No, Io agreed. Then this is a gesture, a tantrum. The gates will reopen. They must reopen. The weft is not a weapon, it is a... He caught himself. It's a machine, Io finished, And machines do what they're told, and nobody's ever been able to tell it anything, so it must not be able to be told. She nodded slowly. That's the axiom, right? First axiom of conquered engineering. The weft is not improvable. She drank her coffee. We improved it, she said. 490 times. You put that in the record, too. Praetor Regnant Osuval Thray of the Valeth stared down at a 21-year-old girl in a maintenance coverall, and for the first time in a career built on knowing what came next, he did not. What do you want? He said. And Io Ferreira looked genuinely surprised. Nothing, she said. I don't want anything. I came to take minutes. She capped the thermos. The wanting, she said, was the part you did. The speaker of order called for a recess. Nobody moved. It was, in retrospect, the moment when the conquered stopped being a government and became 9,000 individuals in a very large room, because a government adjourns and individuals stand there staring at the ceiling. The recess bell rang for 90 seconds, and then somebody switched it off. On the map, 41 anchor gates had gone dark. Restore them, said Praetor Thray. Praetor, said his aide, there's no mechanism. We don't have a mechanism to restore a gate. We've never had one. When a gate fails, we route around it. Then route around them. They're the anchor approaches, Praetor. Every staged squadron in the reclamation fleet is inside the approach envelope of a gate that has furled. The routes go through them. That's what an approach envelope is. Then the fleet will move sublight. The aide made a small, involuntary sound. To Sol 3, he said, at sublight, from the Corvin drift. He did the arithmetic that everyone in the chamber had already done. 11,000 years, Praetor. Thray turned, and the mantle of the first throne slid over his shoulders like something recoiling, and he looked at the girl. Open them, he said. I can't, said Io. You will open them. Praetor, she said, and for the first time there was a small note of something almost like sympathy in her voice, and it was worse than contempt. You're still doing it. You still think there's a switch and that I'm standing on it. There's no switch. Nobody's flipping anything. The gates furled because the crews came out. Explain. Every gate in the weft has a human crew inside it right now, or it did 6 hours ago. She set the thermos on the floor by her foot because she was going to need her hands. That's what custodial care means. That's the job. Somebody's always in there, in the lattice, in the dark, with a wrench. It's been true every hour of every day for 41 years. She held up one finger. When you read Instrument 7 into the record, when you said the words all human personnel are declared forfeit, every human being in the weft was legally in the process of being seized by your government. So they left, not as an attack, not as a strike. They picked up their tools and they walked out of the crawlways and they went home, because there is a line in the custodial concession, Article 12, subsection 4, that says a tender may not remain aboard an anchor gate under conditions of unlawful compulsion, and you wrote that line, Praetor. Your council wrote it. 11,000 years of conquered law is extremely serious about the dignity of contracts. She lowered the finger. And a gate with no crew inside it, she said, goes to sleep, because it's not stupid. It's the only machine in the galaxy that's ever been careful about the people inside it. It furls its lanes so it doesn't cook anybody on the way out. It's a safety interlock, Praetor. 90,000 years old. Your surveyors have had access to that data the entire time. The silence in the hall had developed a texture. You are telling this council, said Matriarch Sullivan slowly, that the weft has closed itself around 4,000 warships, not as an act of war, but because it is being tidy. It's being careful, said Io. There's a difference, and honestly, ma'am, I think it's the only difference that's ever mattered. It was at that point that the 9th throne stood up. The 9th throne of the conquered was, by ancient design, the seat of the clients. The 211 species who paid tariff and provided levy and held, between them, a single weighted vote that had never once in 11,000 years altered an outcome. It was occupied that session by a delegate named Rue of the Ordovi, who was 90 centimeters tall, who had 4 eyes and a nervous habit of grooming her own forearms, and who had been chosen for the post precisely because she was considered incapable of causing trouble. Speaker Rue of the Ordovi stood up in the middle of the ruin of Instrument 7 and cleared her throat and said, "The Ninth Throne wishes to inquire whether this session is being broadcast." The Speaker of Order, glad of a procedural question, glad of anything at all, checked his console. "Full session," he said. "As always, encrypted feed to all seated delegations, all client capitals, all conquered relay hubs, all." He stopped. "All relay hubs," said Speaker Rue. The Concord's communication network did not use the WEFT. It used something older and cheaper, a chain of relay stations, quantum-paired, strung along the same routes as the gates, because when the departed built their network they had thoughtfully provided conduit space for exactly this purpose. The Concord had been using those conduits for 11,000 years. The relay stations sat inside the anchor gates. They were, by the plain reading of Article 9, WEFT infrastructure. They were maintained, exclusively and non-transferably, by human beings. "Oh," said the Speaker of Order. "Yes," said Speaker Rue of the Ordovi, and her 4 eyes were very steady. "Oh. Here is what had happened, and it was not clever, and it was not a plot, and no human being had planned it, and that was the part that would haunt the Concord for 1,000 years." The relay net carried the Council's session feed encrypted, on a single channel, to 8,000 authorized endpoints. It also carried on the same trunk, in a low-priority band that had been assigned to the custodial service 41 years earlier as a courtesy, the tender channel, shift schedules, maintenance logs, and complaints about food. And 11 days before the session, a maintenance crew on Relay Hub 4 had filed a work order properly through the Office of Custodial Affairs, with a receipt, noting that the encryption gate on Trunk 1 was showing degradation in its keying lattice, and that the recommended remedy was replacement, and that replacement parts had been requested, and that pending replacement the trunk would be operating in fallback mode, which is to say unencrypted, which is to say in the clear, and that this condition would persist until the office authorized the expenditure. The Office of Custodial Affairs had rejected the expenditure. The rejection was signed. It cited budgetary constraint. The work order was on file. It was on file in 8,000 places. Every seated delegation had received a copy, because copies of custodial work orders went out with the weekly bulletin, at the bottom on page 900, where nobody read them. The Council of 9 Thrones had voted to exterminate the human species on an open channel, in the clear, and it had done so because it had refused to pay for a replacement part. 211 client worlds had heard it. 600 unrepresented polities, listening on the trunk because listening was free, had heard it. 940 subject planets whose air was scrubbed, and whose water was cycled, and whose orbital rings were held together by contractors under the custodial concession, because the humans had never limited themselves to gates, because when you are the species that fixes things you end up fixing everything, had heard it. They had heard the First Throne describe humanity as a fuse. They had heard the vote. They had heard a girl say too late. "Praetor," said the aide, and his voice had gone somewhere very small, "we are receiving transmissions. From the fleet. From," he looked at his console the way a man looks at a wound, "from the Ordovi Reach, from Kelsia home. From the Corvin Assembly, from the 16 Rings, from Ashet, from Bone, from Tel Vero." He kept reading. He could not stop reading. "From 211 client capitals, Praetor. They are all sending the same document." "What document?" The aide put it on the map. It was not a declaration of war. That was the first thing everyone in the Hall of Nine Thrones understood, and it was the thing that frightened them most, because they knew what to do with a declaration of war. It was a charter. The Charter of Open Hands, it said, across the golden threads in 11 scripts at once. Signed at Anchor 41, in the Ordovai Reach, on the 6th day prior to the present session. Signatories, 611. And then the text, which was short, because it had been written by people who had things to do. We, the undersigned, hold that infrastructure is not property. We hold that the one who maintains a thing has the deepest claim to its governance, and that this claim is not ownership but obligation. We hold that any polity which cannot repair what it rules does not rule it. We therefore establish a common custodial trust, open to all, closed to none, in which every signatory undertakes to teach what it knows and to learn what it does not, and in which the ancient works of the departed shall be held in care by all who are willing to do the work. Nothing in this charter shall be construed as a claim upon any territory, government, tariff, or throne. We are not taking anything. We are simply henceforth doing it ourselves. Praetor Regnant Ossuval Thray of the Valeth read it twice. This is nothing, he said. This is a guild, a workers' association. It has no fleet. It has no tariff authority. It has no. It has the wrench, said Speaker Rue of the Ordovai quietly from the 9th throne. Praetor, it has all of the wrenches. The thing that broke the chamber's discipline was not the charter. It was the moment, about 2 minutes later, when a delegate from the Corvine Assembly stood up in the 6th gallery and asked, in a perfectly reasonable tone, a perfectly reasonable question. Who maintains the atmospheric processors of Valeth Prime? 9,000 delegates turned to look at him. It is a question of fact, said the Corvine, spreading his manipulators. The First Throne's homeworld carries 11 billion inhabitants under a managed atmosphere. The ring forges, the northern scrubber array, the deep water cycle. These are conquered infrastructure, licensed and inspected, and I confess I have never troubled myself to ask who does the actual inspecting, and it occurs to me, Praetor, that neither have you. The Praetor did not answer. He did not answer because he did not know. And the not knowing arrived in him not as information but as a kind of falling, a floor going out, because in the space of 11 minutes Ossuval Thray had discovered that he had spent 9 years investigating the humans and had never once, not one single time, asked what they actually did. Humans, said Io Ferreira into the silence. There are 11,000 of us on Valeth Prime. Well, there were. She said it gently. That was the worst thing about it. She said it the way you tell someone their car needs an oil change. Northern scrubber arrays got a crew of 400, she said. Ringforge 2 has 311. Deepwater cycle's a big one, that's 900, spread over 16 stations, because your water plant is 8,000 years old, and it's held together with a patch schedule that my people wrote in the 2nd decade of the concession and have been running ever since. The processors are on a 4-day maintenance cycle. 4 days, Praetor. That's how long the northern array runs before the intake lattices silt up and the carbon load starts climbing. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed. They were on their 11th day when you started reading Instrument 7, she said, because they'd been asked to stay late, because they liked it here, because a lot of them have been here 15, 20 years and their kids were born here, and they were on their 11th day of a 4-day cycle when the first throne of the conquered of 9 thrones stood up in front of 9,000 people and called them a fuse. The Hall of 9 Thrones was 2 kilometers of black basalt and fused starlight, and it had been built to make visitors feel small, and it was, at that moment, doing something it had never been designed to do. It was listening. They left this morning, said Io. 6 hours ago, before the session opened. Every human on this planet walked to a shuttle and went up to the yards, and I stayed because somebody had to take the minutes. She picked up her slate. Praetor, she said, your heir has about 9 days in it. Take her, said Threy. The proctors moved. They were fast Veilith proctors were bred for it. 4 arms and a low center, and a reaction time that made them the finest close-quarters guards in the Concord. And they crossed the well of the floor in under a second, and their claw hands closed on Iolanthe Ferreira's arms and lifted her clean off the ground. 9,000 delegates made no sound at all. Io did not struggle. She hung there, 20 centimeters off the basalt, a small woman in a gray coverall in the grip of 2 creatures 3 times her mass, and she looked at Praetor Threy with an expression of enormous, terrible patience. There it is, she said. You will open the gates, said Threy, or you will be opened. You still think I'm the switch. You are the last human being within reach of this council, said Threy, and this council is not accustomed to being out of reach of anything. And then the lights went out. Not all of them. The chamber lighting stayed. The null field holding the weft map stayed, gold and cold and turning. What went out was the hall's environmental system, the humidifiers that made the mist, the pressure regulators that kept 2 kilometers of enclosed basalt breathable for 9,000 beings of 40 different biologies, the thermal exchangers buried in the floor, the scrubber trunk that ran under the thrones. It did not fail. That was the horror of it. It went out the way a light goes out when someone somewhere decides that it is time for bed. The mist stopped falling. The great slow breath of the hall, the one that nobody had ever noticed because it had been there since before any of them were born, simply stopped, and the room got very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. On the wall behind the first throne, a maintenance panel that had not been opened in 9 years lit up amber and displayed, in the plain block script of the Terran custodial service, a message that had been sitting in its queue for 6 hours, waiting for a condition to be met. Custodial Service Notice, Hall of 9 THRONES, Environmental Trunk 1A. Service suspended under Article 12.4, Unlawful Compulsion. Condition of suspension, detention or harm of accredited custodial personnel. This system will resume on release. We left it better than we found it. The proctors looked at the panel, then they looked at the Praetor. Then, without being told, because they had lungs, and because 9,000 delegates were now breathing the same finite volume of air, they set Iolanthe Ferreira gently back on the floor. She straightened her collar, she picked up her thermos. Behind the first throne, the maintenance panel went from amber to green, and somewhere deep under the basalt, a very old fan began to turn again, and the mist came drifting down out of the dark like snow. You wrote that clause too, said Io Ferreira. Article 12, nobody ever reads to the end. At the 6th hour of the session, the Veilith Home Fleet reported an unidentified vessel translating into the inner system. It came in slow. That was the first thing the trackers noted, and they noted it with confusion, because nothing came into a defended home system slowly. It had crossed from the Veilith anchor gate on a lazy ballistic arc, running with its navigation lights on, broadcasting its registry in the clear on every band including 3 that had been obsolete for 1,000 years, and it was decelerating with the unhurried grace of a barge coming into a river dock. The Home Fleet Watch officer put it on the map, and the Hall of 9 Thrones got its first look at the ship that would, in the histories, be called the most powerful vessel ever to enter conquered space. It was hideous. 940 meters long and shaped like nothing at all, a spine, a spar, and then an accretion. Gantries, cranes, coolant drums, a forest of manipulator arms folded back along the hull like the legs of a sleeping insect. Spare lattice core lashed to the dorsal frame in bundles. 600 meters of cable spooled on a drum the size of a house. The hull plating was 3 different colors because it had been patched 3 different times from 3 different scrapyards. There were handprints on it. Actual handprints in the paint, hundreds of them around the airlocks, where crews had touched the hull on their way out and on their way back in, for 30 years, until the handprints had become a layer of their own. It carried no weapons. It carried no weapons at all. Not a rail, not a beam, not a mine, not so much as a point defense gun. And the Concord's targeting systems, scanning it, reported no threat and did not know what to do with the answer. Painted on the spine, in letters 4 meters high, in a language that 8,000 of the 9,000 delegates could not read, was its name. Long way home. Terran Custodial Service, Kestrel-class gate tender, commissioned 31 years ago, registered displacement, 290,000 tons, of which 4/5 was tools. A repair ship, said Matriarch Sullivan. Yeah, said Io Ferreira. She had been standing in the well of the hall for 6 hours. Somebody at some point had brought her a chair, and nobody knew who, and she had thanked them, and she had not sat down. That's the flagship, she said. That's what we've got. That's the whole human navy, ma'am, right there, that ugly thing with the cranes on it. We never built a warship. We couldn't afford one, and we never wanted one, and honestly there was never any point because you have 4,011 and we'd have had 6. She looked up at the map, at the battered spar of the ship coming in slow with its lights on. So we built that instead, and we sent it into every gate in the weft and it fixed them. And now it is here, said Sullivan. Now it's here, Io agreed, because I asked it to come. Fire on it, said Praetor. The Home Fleet Watch Officer, on the wall display, saluted. It was a good salute. It was the last order of the old Concord, and it was received with perfect discipline, and 1,100 Valith warships in orbit over Valith Prime brought their weapons to bear on an unarmed maintenance vessel. And then they did not fire. Watch Officer, said Thray. Praetor, said the watch officer, and his crest had gone flat, and there was a note in his voice that no Valith officer had ever been permitted to have on an open channel. The fleet is not answering the helm. Explain. The drives, Praetor. He was reading now from a console, and behind him the bridge of the flagship had gone chaotic in a slow and disciplined way. Every capital drive in the fleet is a licensed weft derivative. Class 4 folding cores. They're not shut down, they're not damaged there. He stopped. He looked for a word that would not end his career and could not find one, and used the word anyway because his career had already ended and he had not noticed yet. They're declining, he said. It is worth explaining what the Concord had actually built, in 11,000 years, on top of the weft. Everything, that was the answer, everything they had. The Concord had never understood the gates, and had never been able to make one, but they had been able to copy, clumsily, partially, with a success rate of about 1 in 100, the smaller machines they found inside them. The folding core that drove a Valith battleship was a scaled-down anchor lattice, cast from a mold taken off a component that had been pulled out of a gate by a Kelsha salvage team 8,000 years ago. The pressure regulators in the Hall of 9 Thrones were weft derivative. The atmospheric processors on 1,100 worlds were weft derivative. The relay net was a weft conduit with a Concord jack shoved into it. Every one of those machines carried, deep in its architecture, the same handshake protocol. It had never mattered. It was a vestigial thing, a bit of ancestral code inherited from the mold, a machine asking a question into a void that had, for 90,000 years, given no answer. The question was, are the people inside safe? And for 90,000 years, with nobody home to check, the machines had defaulted to yes. Something had woken up in Anchor 1, and it had spent 11 months quietly, patiently, doing what a caretaker does when it comes back to a house it has been away from. It had walked the halls. It had checked the doors. It had gone through every machine in the galaxy that carried its maker's handshake, 300 million of them on 1,100 worlds, and it had asked the question, and this time it had waited for an answer. And the humans, being the only ones who had ever bothered to talk to it, had answered. Not with orders. You could not order it. Io had tried to explain this to the Concord's engineers later and had mostly failed. It was not a weapon and it could not be pointed. It had exactly one interest, and it was very old and very simple, and it was not about power at all. It wanted to know that the machines were being cared for, and that the people inside them were safe. That was all it had ever wanted. That was the whole of it. 90,000 years of an empty house, and a faithful old animal walking the halls at night, checking the doors, and the only species in the galaxy that had ever thought to scratch it behind the ears. So when Praetor Oscival Thray ordered 1,100 warships to fire on the long way home, the folding cores in those warships asked the question they had been built to ask. And the answer came back from the crawlways of 3,106 gates, from 400,000 tenders who had put down their wrenches and walked out, from a maintenance panel in the Hall of 9 Thrones, from a girl standing in a well of black basalt with a dented thermos. No, the people are not safe. And 300 million machines on 1,100 worlds, across 11,000 years of an empire that had been very careful about who was allowed to stand near the gates and had never once considered who was allowed to go inside them, quietly, politely, without a single shot fired, declined. "It is a bluff," said Praetor Thray. He said it into a silence that had gone past shock and out the other side into something almost dreamy. 9,000 delegates watched him. The weft map turned. On the display, the long way home came drifting into a parking orbit over Valith Prime, 900 meters of cranes and coolant drums and handprints, and did nothing at all. "It is a bluff," he said again, "because a caretaker cannot choose. A machine cannot choose. There is no intelligence in that network. There is a girl with an access key, and she has been permitted to hold it because we were not paying attention, and I will have it." He turned, and he descended the last steps of the first throne, and he crossed the well of the hall toward Iolanth Ferreira. And he reached into the mantle and took out the shard. It was about the size of a forearm. It was the color of nothing. The eye kept sliding off it, and it was very slightly the wrong shape, in the way that everything from inside a gate was the wrong shape, and where it had been cut the edge was raw and bright and wrong. The gallery, seeing it, made a sound. "Anchor 1, said Matriarch Selavun, and her chiming voice had cracked, and crystalline beings did not crack. "Praetor, Praetor, you told this council that Anchor 1 could not be opened." "It could not," said Thray, "not by any lawful means." He held the shard up, and he looked at Io. 14 months ago, he said, I sent a cutting team into Anchor 1. Valith, not human. My own people, at my own expense, without the knowledge of this chamber, because I had spent 9 years watching an inferior species get rich on our infrastructure, and I had come to a conclusion that none of you had the courage to reach, that whatever was inside those gates was not theirs. It was ours. It was the inheritance of the civilized, and it was being pawed at by janitors. He turned the shard in his 4 hands. They cut for 11 days, he said. 41 of them went in, 9 came out, and they brought me this, a core fragment from the innermost lattice, still live, still carrying the signal. And 11 months ago, when it began to speak, his crest flared, and it was terrible because it was pride, it was still pride, even now, it spoke to me. No, said Io Ferreira, it didn't. It has spoken every day since, in my chambers, in the dark, the rhythm, the pulse. I have listened to it for 11 months, and I have understood that it was waiting for a hand of sufficient authority, and I have prepared this council to give it what it requires. And today, when the last of the vermin were swept out of its halls, I was going to. Praetor, said Io, what was the pattern? He stopped. The rhythm, she said. You said you listened to it every day, in the dark, 11 months, so you'd know it by now. What was it saying? Oscival Thray stood in the well of the Hall of 9 Thrones with the stolen heart of Anchor 1 in his hands, and he opened his mandibles, and he tapped it out. He could not help himself. 11 months of it, alone, in a dark room, the most powerful being in the galaxy listening to a scrap of light whisper to him about his destiny. Tap, 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 rest. 4 beats and a rest. Io Ferreira closed her eyes. That's a name, she said. It is a summons. It's a name. Her voice did not rise. It did not have to. That's how it says a name. It's the only way it can. It takes the pulse of somebody it knew and it gives it back to you over and over because it can't say anything else and it's been trying for 90,000 years to be heard. She opened her eyes. You cut 41 people out of that gate, she said, and 32 of them didn't come out. And you've been sitting in the dark for 11 months listening to a machine grieve, and you thought it was talking about you. The Hall of 9 Thrones did not move. You cut a piece out of a caretaker, said Io Ferreira, and it has been calling for its dead. That's what's been whispering to you, Praetor. That's your inheritance. That's the voice of the thing you were going to secure. Praetor Regnant Asuval Thray looked down at the shard in his hands. And very quietly, with no light, no discharge, no drama at all, in the manner of everything the departed had ever built, it stopped. The tapping stopped, the faint warmth in it stopped. The color that had never quite been a color drained out of it, and what was left in the Praetor's 4 hands was a piece of dead gray stone, 90,000 years old, cut out of the living body of the oldest machine in the galaxy by a creature who had wanted it. And it was worth precisely nothing, and it would never be worth anything again. He had held it for 14 months. He had reached and closed his hand. And the thing he had closed his hand on had died in it, because that was the only thing it could do, and because he had never, in 9 years of investigation, in 11 months of listening, in a lifetime at the summit of the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced, thought to ask it a single question. The second throne rose. Praetor Regnant Asuval Thray, said Matriarch Selavan of the Ithkar, and there was no chiming warmth left in her voice at all. You have this day admitted before 9,000 delegates and an open channel to the unauthorized violation of a weft anchor gate, an act which is a capital offense under Instrument 1, the founding law of this concord, to which your own house is signatory. Matriarch, you have further admitted, she said, that the danger you presented to this chamber, the danger on which we voted, Praetor, on which we voted, was a danger of your own manufacture. There was no human conspiracy. There was no clandestine contact. There was a machine crying out because you cut it, and you brought us its cry and told us it was a fuse. The third throne rose. Then the fourth, then the 6th and the 7th, and it was not courage, and nobody in that chamber ever pretended afterward that it was courage. It was arithmetic. 11 billion Valeth had 9 days of air. 211 client worlds had signed a charter. 4,011 warships were sitting dead in the approaches to gates that had gone to sleep, and every one of those warships had a crew, and every one of those crews was somebody's. The thrones that rose that day rose to save themselves. That is simply the truth of it. Greed does not become wisdom because it changes direction. It only changes direction. But they rose. The first throne is vacated, said Selavan. And in the middle of the well of the hall, forgotten by 9,000 delegates for the first time in his life, the most powerful being in the galaxy stood holding a dead gray rock. They gave Iolanth Ferrer the floor. Not out of respect. It would be 100 years before anyone in the Concord could honestly call it respect. They gave her the floor because there was nobody else to give it to, and because a room that has just discovered it is standing over a 9-day drop will listen to anyone who sounds like they have a ladder. She did not want it. That was on the record too, and the record is very clear. She said, I'm a junior attaché 3rd class. I'm not authorized to negotiate anything. I came here to take minutes, and the second throne of the Concord of 9 thrones said, Child, there is no one left who is authorized to do anything. Speak. So she spoke. Okay, said Io. She put her slate down. She was aware, distantly, that her hands were shaking, and that they had been shaking for about 4 hours, and that nobody had noticed because she had kept them busy. First thing, she said, nobody's going to die. 9,000 delegates went very still. I want to say that first, because I've been standing here for 6 hours watching you all do arithmetic, and I wanted out of the room. She looked up at the galleries, at the Ithcar, at the Corving, at the small Ordovai in the ninth throne, at 11,000 years of an institution that had voted 8,807 to 4 to kill everyone she had ever loved. Nobody is going to suffocate. Not on Valith Prime, not on Kelsha Home, not on any of the 1,100 worlds that are currently sitting there realizing they don't know how their own air works. Our crews are already moving. The long way home has been receding the northern scrubber array for about 90 minutes. They started before I said anything, because I didn't have to say anything, because they're tenders and there's a 4-day cycle and it's day 11. You will restore the systems, said Sullivan. We never stopped them. Io shook her head. You keep hearing this as a threat, ma'am, and I don't know how to make you hear it any other way, so I'm just going to keep saying it until it lands. We didn't turn anything off. We walked out of a building where we'd been declared forfeit property. The building has an interlock. The interlock did what it was built to do, which is take care of the people inside, and it will keep doing that forever, because that is the only thing it has ever done. She lifted her scarred hand. You want the machines to work, she said. Then let somebody take care of them. That's the whole price. That's the entire negotiating position of the human species, and it hasn't changed in 41 years, and it isn't going to change now, and I'd like the record to show that we didn't come up with it. We got it from the thing in the gates. It's been trying to tell you for 90,000 years, and nobody ever went inside to listen. There was a delegate. His name is not in the minutes, and he never claimed it afterward, and probably that was wise, who stood in the fourth gallery and asked the question that the whole chamber was thinking and had been too frightened to say. Why, he said, are you helping us? And Io Ferreira, 21 years old, 11 days from home, standing on the floor of a room that had spent the morning deciding to burn her planet, looked up at him with genuine bewilderment. Because your air's out, she said. We ordered your destruction. Yeah, said Io, you did, and in about a week when I've had some sleep, I imagine I'm going to have some very ugly feelings about that, and I expect they'll be with me for the rest of my life. She rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. But that's a thing about me. That's not a thing about your air. Your air doesn't know what you voted. There are 11 billion people down there, and about 9 billion of them have never heard of me, and 400 million of them are children, and the northern scrubber array does not care whose fault it is. She dropped her hand. That's the job, she said. That's all the job has ever been. Somebody has to be inside the machine, and it can't be somebody who's keeping score. The Hall of 9 Thrones was silent, and the mist came down, and somewhere under 2 kilometers of basalt an old fan turned, because a human being had walked back into the trunk room on her way to the chamber and had reset it by hand, because it was on her way. The terms were not generous. People expected them to be, afterward, and were disappointed, because the histories wanted a triumph, and what actually happened was a work order. The human delegation, which was, for the first 6 days, Iolanth Ferreira, a chair, and a very bad connection to a ship in parking orbit, asked for 4 things. The first was that the custodial concession be dissolved. Not revoked, dissolved. Article 9 had made humanity the perpetual, exclusive, non-transferable custodian of the Weft, and Io stood in the well of the hall and asked, formally, for that clause to be struck, and the conquered did not understand her, and asked her to repeat it, and she repeated it 3 times before it took. Exclusive is the problem, she said. Exclusive is how you got here. You handed one species the keys to everything, and then you didn't look at us for 41 years. And that was fine while we were the ones holding them, and it was fine because we happened to be, she paused, hunting for a word she could stand behind, because we happen to be the kind of people who like fixing things. But that's luck. That's not a system. That's just luck, and you bet 11,000 years of civilization on it, and you have absolutely no idea how close you came. So the concession was dissolved, and the charter of open hands was seated in its place, and the second thing she asked for was written into it in plain language. Every species in the Concord, without exception, would send crews into the gates. Not observers, not surveyors, crews, with tools, on rotation. Including the Valeth, especially the Valeth. "You're going to learn to fix your own scrubbers," she said, and the sixth gallery made a sound of horror that she did not acknowledge. "Because the alternative is that you spend another 11,000 years being carried, and one day whoever's carrying you will get tired, and they might not be us." The third thing she asked for was the return of the shard. The Praetor, the former Praetor. He had been stripped of the mantle by then and was being held in his own chambers under a guard of Ithcar, which was the only detail of the whole affair that anybody found satisfying, surrendered it without a word. It was dead. It stayed dead. The long way home carried it out to Anchor 1, and a crew of 11 went in with it, and they were inside for 19 days, and when they came out they did not talk about it, and the anchor's inner lattice was whole again, and the tapping stopped. The fourth thing was the smallest, and it was the one that Io Ferreira had to fight for, and it was the only time in the entire proceeding that she raised her voice. She wanted the names of the 32. The Valeth cutting team. The ones who had gone into Anchor 1 on the Praetor's private order and had not come out. 32 people who had done a terrible thing because they had been told to, and who had died in the dark in a place they should never have been, and whose families had been paid off and told nothing. The Conquered did not see the point. The Conquered, in fact, resisted, on the grounds that the operation had been unlawful, and the personnel were therefore not entitled to acknowledgement. Io Ferreira stood in the well of the Hall of 9 Thrones and said, "Give me their names or I walk out of this building, and I don't come back." They gave her the names. She read them into the record herself, all 32, slowly, mispronouncing about half of them, and when she was finished she said the thing that the tenders said, that they said at funerals and did not explain to outsiders, and the translators struggled with it and rendered it 4 different ways, and none of the 4 were right. "They left it better than they found it," she said. And then, because someone had to, she added, "They didn't, but somebody has to say it, so I'm saying it for them." 3 years later, on a cold, clear morning in the northern shipyards of Valeth Prime, a class of apprentices stood in a hangar bay looking up at the underside of a ship. There were 19 of them. 11 were Valeth, which would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier, young ones, first molt, their carapaces still soft and pale, their crests barely feathered. 4 were Corvine. 2 were Ithcar, and they were the ones everyone worried about, because the gate interiors had broken the Ithcar once before, and nobody was sure it wouldn't do it again. And both of them had volunteered anyway and had told the medical board, in identical words, that a crack was a thing that could be repaired. One was Ordovi, 90 centimeters tall, and she was going to be extraordinary, and everyone already knew it. And one was Kelsha, and he had not stopped talking since he arrived. The ship above them was the long way home, up on blocks being reworked. It looked worse than ever. There were more handprints. The woman walking them through the pre-entry checklist was 24 years old. She had a burn scar across the back of her right hand and a dented steel thermos clipped to her belt. And she was, on paper, the chief custodial instructor of the Valeth Prime Yard, which was a title that had not existed until somebody made it up for her, and which she disliked, and which she had tried 3 times to give away. "Rule 1, said Io Ferreira. "You go in with a partner. Nobody goes in alone. Not ever, not for 5 minutes, not to grab a tool you forgot. If I catch you in a crawlway alone, I will pull your certification and I will not care how sorry you are." She looked down the line. Rule 2. When you get inside, and this is going to happen on your first shift, so I want you ready for it, you're going to hear it. It's a hum. It's very low, and you'll feel it in your teeth before you hear it in your ears. And about a third of you are going to panic, and that's fine, that's normal, everybody panics. Sit down. Turn off your lamp. The first molt Valeth at the end of the line raised 2 of his 4 hands, which was the polite form. Instructor, he said, what do we do then? Io Ferreira thought about the question. She had been asked it 300 times by now, and she still had not found a better answer than the true one. You listen, she said. That's it. You just listen. It's been alone for a very long time, and it's not going to say anything you understand, and it's not going to do anything for you, and it doesn't want anything from you. It just wants to know somebody's there. She shrugged. So be there. And then get up and fix whatever's broken, because that's the actual job, and the hum is not an excuse to sit around. The apprentices laughed. The Kelsha laughed hardest and longest because he always did. And Io Ferreira, who did not sleep well and had not slept well in 3 years, who still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning hearing 9,000 delegates vote, looked at 19 young people in borrowed coveralls standing under the belly of the ugliest ship in the galaxy, and felt something in her chest come loose that had been welded shut since she was 14. The chamber where the Council of 9 Thrones had once sat was, by then, no longer a chamber. They had not torn it down. There had been a proposal to tear it down, and it had been defeated narrowly by an argument that Io had made without ever intending it to become an argument. She had walked through the empty hall during the 2nd month of the negotiations, looked up at the great basalt bowl with the mist coming down, and said to nobody in particular, "It's a good building. Somebody put a lot of work into this." So it stood. They pulled out the thrones, all 9 of them, including the first, and the mantle went into a case in a museum where children pressed their faces against the glass and were disappointed by how small it looked, and they left the tiered galleries and the terrible acoustics and the null field where the weft map turned. The map was still there. 3,106 points of gold, all of them lit, all of them humming, all of them crawling with people. And on the floor of the well, where the plinth had stood, where the sanction of erasure had rested on its coffin lid of engraved crystal, they had bolted down a plate. The crystal itself had been ground up. There had been a ceremony. It had been extremely boring, and Io had not attended, because there had been a coolant fault at Ringforge 2 and she had gone to look at it instead, and the Conquered had waited 4 hours for her and had eventually held the ceremony without her. And everyone agreed afterward that this was the most appropriate thing that could possibly have happened. The plate on the floor was plain steel. There was no gold on it, and no crystal, and no light. It carried the date of the session. It carried the vote for 8,807, against 4, abstain 190, because the Conquered had decided, after a debate that lasted 9 months and cost 3 governments, that it would not be permitted to forget. And below the vote it carried 2 lines. The first was the order, as Praetor Regnant Osuval Thray of the Valeth had spoken it, in the flat cadence of a man reading a shipping manifest, on the last morning of the old world. Destroy them, let it be done. And the second was the answer, as a 21-year-old junior attaché, 3rd class, had given it from the 11th gallery, not shouted, not threatened, not sworn, just said, in a voice pitched exactly for the acoustics of a room that had been built to make her feel small. Too late. Visitors always asked what it meant. The guides had a standard explanation, and it took about 4 minutes, and it covered the fleet in the approaches and the open channel and the 611 signatures at Anchor 41, and it was accurate, and it was wrong. Because the fleet had been a fact and the broadcast had been an accident, and the charter had been 6 days old, and none of those were what the girl had meant. What she had meant, and she said so once, years later, to an Ordovai apprentice who asked her at 3 in the morning in a crawlway at Anchor 9, with their lamps off and the hum coming up through the deck plates in 4 beats and a rest, was simpler than that, and older, and it had nothing to do with fleets at all. They stood up in that room, Io Ferreira said, in the dark, and they voted to destroy the people who took care of them, and they thought that was a decision they were about to make. She was quiet for a moment. The hum went on. Somewhere above them, 80 kilometers of a machine that had been built before there where people held its lanes open and let the ships of 611 worlds go through, one after another, all night, forever. It wasn't, she said. It was a decision they'd already made 41 years ago, when they handed us the mop and walked away, and never once came down to see what we were doing with it. Everything after that was just the paperwork catching up. The Ordovai thought about it. So when you said too late, she said, you did not mean that they had lost. No, said Io Ferreira. She reached out in the dark and put her scarred hand flat against the cold, living wall of the oldest kind thing in the galaxy and felt it breathe. I meant that they'd been given something enormous and they'd been careless with it for a very long time and the bill had come. That's all. That's all it ever was. She got up and clipped her lamp back on and picked up her wrench. Come on, she said. Coolant seam on 9's been stuttering for a week, and I'd like to leave it better than we found it.